I want to take a few minutes and try and give you some advice and help as you are taking this class and trying to do problems correctly. So this really involves when you're using some kind of online site to do your homework and maybe even your quizzes. Now I teach classes that use both My Math Lab, sometimes abbreviated MML, and also another online homework and quiz called WebAssign. But basically, the same kinds of rules are going to apply. I'm sure if you've taken online math before, you've oftentimes been frustrated that you basically have done the problem correctly, but when you enter the answer, you don't enter it quite in the form that they're expecting, or maybe you're just a little bit off, or maybe forgot to do one sort of oversight kind of thing. And unfortunately, you'll miss the whole problem, even though you really knew what you were doing. So that's one of the downsides of doing problems online, is you have to really be careful to try and make sure that you give the answer just like the program wants it. So let me give you some tips of the most common mistakes I see students make that cause them to miss a problem, even though really they did it correctly and pretty much should have gotten the correct answer, but the computer doesn't know that. So let me go through 3 or 4 of the most common things I see, and I'll try and do some sort of quick examples just to make sure you understand what I'm saying. The first one is, and this has been true, hopefully you've learned this in math, is whenever you're finished with a math problem in the world of math, you're taught to either reduce or simplify your answer. So reduce is probably what you've learned first, because that goes back to when you first learned about fractions. So if you were doing a problem and by the time you got finished, that was your answer, you were taught that you don't leave this as your answer, because whenever you have a fraction that can be reduced, you should always reduce it. Now, sometimes maybe your teacher or maybe you thought like this is the correct answer. But you know what? 2/4 or 2/4 is not incorrect. It's just not in the form that they want the answer to be. And in the world of math, there are these rules that math people all agree on that is deemed to be necessary for an answer to be quote unquote correct. So when I'm teaching math, if someone leaves an answer like this, I don't tell them it's wrong, because this isn't really wrong, but it's not in the final form that the math world expects. So this is an obvious one, right? Where you reduce and simplify. One that's a little bit trickier, because maybe you're not as familiar, is especially simplifying, especially as you work with radicals, right? The most common radical is like a square root. So if you have a square root of 5 in your answer, you're pretty much done. There's nothing you can do. However, an obvious issue might be if your answer, if you're working a problem and you get to square root of 4, obviously, you're not going to give the answer square root of 4, because we all know square root of 4 equals 2. So 2 would be your answer. What gets a little tricky is, because some of you haven't done this for a while or haven't done it a lot, there are oftentimes radicals that need to be simplified. If you did a problem and your answer was square root of 8, and you entered it into most online programs, it would probably count it wrong because this is not simplified. And in the world of math, they always want you to simplify radicals. So I'm not going to give a lesson on simplifying, except just to say basically 8 is the same as 4 square root of 2. Square root of 4 is 2. So bottom line is square root of 8 equals 2 square root of 2. This will be the answer they're looking for. And let me say this, when I talk about what does or doesn't happen with online programs, I'm not 100% sure about this stuff because sometimes even I can occasionally be surprised at what answers online programs do and do not allow. So to me, it's not always an exact science, but I'm pretty sure most online programs would probably count it wrong if you left the answer square root of 8. I think they want to see 2 square root of 2. But radicals can get tricky because here's something that's interesting. When you probably were first taught radicals, you were probably taught that in the world of math, they normally don't want you to ever leave a square root in the bottom of a fraction. And you were taught how to rationalize the denominator. In this case, you multiply by square root of 2. And 1 over square root of 2 is the same as square root of 2 over 2. And the math world likes this answer better. However, what's interesting is, I think what's interesting is a lot of math programs oftentimes will accept this as an answer. So it seems like nowadays they don't get hung up so much on having a square root in the denominator. However, in a recent class I was teaching, I saw a student answered this. Now, one of the rules in math, which they, once again, this is all subjective. I'm just saying the program, I think it was I think it's My Math Lab, they counted this wrong. Well, what you can do in this case is you can combine this into one fraction, and then that fraction reduces. Now, here's one rule I think they usually enforce. In the world of math, they usually don't like you to leave oftentimes a fraction under the radical. So in this case, you could break it up into square root of 1 over square root of 7. Now, I think probably this is an okay answer, 1 over square root of 7. But if you wanted to go ahead and rationalize it just to be safe, so once again, just be aware when you have fractions or when you have a radical or square root in your answer, oftentimes you have to make sure it's reduced or simplified for them to like the answer. Now, here's a big one for online math. Oftentimes, if you're working out a problem and the answer is going to be some kind of a decimal, we do a calculation. Let me call this. So this is first thing I told you to be careful of. Make sure you reduce and simplify. Let me take a minute, Mal. Don't round numbers too soon or too much. All right, what does this mean? Oftentimes when you're doing a problem online and it's going to be some kind of a calculation where the answer is a decimal, for the answer, they will say something like round to 2 decimal places. Now, the first thing to realize when you give an answer, if your answer does not have 2 decimal places, they will probably count it wrong because you did not put it in the right form. So sometimes errors that students make, they don't pay attention to what form the answer should be in. So maybe maybe you give an answer, that's your answer, but they actually requested, it told you to round 2 decimal places. So that is the correct answer. They're going to count this wrong. And maybe another student wasn't paying attention and they just wrote that as the answer. That's going to be counted as wrong also. So first of all, you're doing a problem, check and remember what form they want the answer to be in. So that is one issue. Now, in terms of rounding, let me just do an actual problem that occurred in a trig class. So just so you know, to do this problem, we had to calculate an angle. So this is like an intermediate calculation. This isn't the final answer. We had a 140-degree angle, and in the world of trig, we had to change it to radians. Now, hopefully most of you remember this thing called pi from working with geometry some. So this is like an intermediate step because the angle was given to us 140 degrees and we need the angle to be in radians. So this is the calculation to convert this angle to a different unit. Very common in a trig class. So 2 issues with this. First of all, let me talk about what the student did. The student, so here my calculator, right? Pretty basic old calculator. I'm going to multiply 140. Now the nice thing is my calculator has a pi key. And if you ever are using pi in the calculation, you always need to use the pi key on your calculator. Don't just enter 3.14 for pi, because you will usually not end up with the correct answer. So 140 times pi divided by 180. Now you see it's a bunch of decimal places. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to write a bunch of these decimal places out. 2.433, maybe just go this much, 461. Here's what the student did, which is not a bad thing at all. When the student took this number to continue working, she rounded it to 2.443, which seems fine. That's like 3 digits. Just so you know, this problem that she did, they were actually asking that the answer be rounded to decimal places. So she's doing a calculation here. The student actually kept 3 decimal places. But you know what? So then this was the area of the sector. So then turns out to do the final calculation, this is what the student did. So they took 40 squared, 1600 times that 2.443, and divided by 2 equals. And they had this answer. And since it was 2 decimal places, I would give this. But you know what the actual answer The correct answer was 1954.77. In other words, the decimal places was off. And my math lab said that was an incorrect answer. So what should have been done? Well, here in this case, here the problem was at this point in time, the student rounded off this number here, which honestly, it was 3 places. It probably should not have mattered, but it did. So here's how the student should have done this problem. You go back to this calculation, and the easiest thing to do is, and most of you guys have very good calculators, try and to not stop here, but try, in other words, this number is going to go right here. So here's the best way to do this calculation to make sure you get it right. You go back to this step. I'm going to redo this step. 140 times pi divided by 180 equals. Here's that number. I'm going to leave that number in my calculator and then go ahead and use it for this calculation. Now, a lot of you have very fancy calculators. You can actually type in this whole equation, but whatever you need to do. Worst case is you can take this whole number here like to 6 digits and use that number down here. And maybe I'll do that in a minute. Let me take this calculation and simply now keep doing this problem. So I'm going to multiply by 1600, which is 40 squared is 1600, and then divide by 2, because you multiply by a half, it's like dividing by 2. And then if I look at my calculator, my answer is 1954.77 when I round it. And then my answer is going to be correct. All I did was I did not round off this number. Now let's say I just used this number and plugged it in here. Let's see how close the answer is. So I'm going to use 2.443461 times 1600 divided by 2, and then you get the same answer. So the lesson is, when you're doing some of these problems where the answers, they're asking you for like 2 or 3 decimal places, as you have intermediate calculations, you have to either let your calculator save this whole number, or if you need to re-enter this number, you need to save like 5 or 6 decimal places. Because if you start cutting off these decimal numbers too soon, by the time you get to your final answer, it's probably going to be wrong. So I hope you're all getting that. So as you're doing a calculation, especially if they're asking for an answer with 2 or 3 decimal places, as you're doing your intermediate steps, you can't be cutting off numbers. You got to save at least probably 5 or 6 or 7 decimal places. Or if you can let your calculator store everything, that's even better. And another thing, especially in trig class, we're going to use pi a lot for calculations. If you just plug in 3.14 for pi, you will probably get the wrong answer. Hopefully, all your calculators have a pi key, because look at when you actually look at pi is 3.1415926. If you have to enter pi as a number, you should at least enter it like maybe to six places, 3.141593. Never do a problem where you just enter 3.14 for pi. It'll probably be wrong. So if you have a pi key on your calculator, always use the pi key. For some reason, if you don't have a pi key, then you got to use like maybe 6 digits to make sure it's correct. So once again, this comes under the category, don't round numbers too soon. If you have intermediate steps and calculations to get to the final answer, don't round. In trig class, we're going to have problems where when we get to law of sines and cosines, it's very common students will try and be rounding numbers off in the middle of the problem. If you do that, you will probably not get the answer that the computer's looking for. I'm not going to say it's a wrong answer, but you're not going to get the exact answer they're looking for just because you rounded too soon. So these are the kinds of things that are the biggest culprits of getting wrong answers online. So once again, make sure you reduce, make sure if you have radicals, you simplify. I know this can be a little tricky to see what they exactly want. And then a really big one is as you're doing calculations, then don't round too soon. You have to use something like pi. Make sure you use a very accurate number for pi. Don't just put in 3.14. And then also make sure when you give your final answer, you need to put it in the form it's requesting. Once it is 2 decimal places, you got to give 2. And hopefully everybody remembers rounding, right? So if my answer is 14.31624, and they ask me to round it to 2 decimal places, so this is going to be my last digit. So you always look to the next digit, and if it's 5 or above, then you round up, right? However, if this was my answer, and I'm going to round it to the 2nd decimal place, then I look here, and since it's less than 5, then that digit does not change. All right, so rounding. Hopefully it's something you've learned before, maybe it's been a while ago, maybe you haven't had to round for a while, but it's important in this class to be able to round properly to get the correct answers. All right, so those are some really common mistakes that students make that frustrates them when they're first learning to do this online homework, when they really have done the problem correctly, but they keep getting the answer wrong. So hopefully this will help for you to avoid some of those problems.